The morning before my sister's wedding, our driver quietly urged, "Hide deep in the shadows and wait, you must hear this." I refused, but he pleaded, "Trust me." Half an hour later I heard, "My name is Morgan. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the family ATM, the crisis manager, and the human shield. If there was a fire, I was the one holding the hose. If there was a debt, I was the one writing the check." My sister Clara, on the other hand, was the family jewel. She is 25, sweet, delicate, and entirely oblivious to how the real world operates. But I never blamed her for that. You see, when I was 22, our mother passed away. I remember sitting by her hospital bed, the sterile smell of bleach burning my nose, holding her thin hand. Her last words to me weren't about her own life, they were a plea. She looked at me, her eyes clouded with pain, and asked me to keep the family together. She begged me to always take care of little Clara. I promised her I would. And for 10 years, that promise was the iron chain around my neck. Right now, I am sitting in my home office, rubbing my temples, staring at a stack of final invoices for Clara's wedding. It is not just a wedding. It is a royal coronation. My father, Bradley, insisted on it. Bradley is a man who values the appearance of wealth far more than actual financial stability. He is the chairman of our family supply chain and logistics company, a company that was practically bleeding out until I stepped in to run the operations. When Clara announced her engagement to Dylan, a guy who is about as sharp as a butter knife but has a nice smile, Bradley decided we needed to throw the event of the decade. A networking opportunity, he called it. Of course, he didn't have the liquid cash for it without taking out a disastrous high-interest loan that would have tanked our quarterly earnings. So, who stepped in? Me. I funded 70% of this extravagant circus out of my personal savings and my executive bonuses. I paid the $75,000 deposit for the grand ballroom. I paid for the imported white orchids that Clara absolutely had to have because she saw them on Pinterest. I did it because that is what the older, responsible daughter does. I did it to honor my mother. I was exhausted, drained down to my bones, but I felt a twisted sense of pride. I was holding the roof up so my family could dance safely underneath it. I had no idea the roof was about to collapse directly onto my head. Part 1.2. The illusion of a partnership. It wasn't just my family I was carrying. I thought I had a partner to help bear the weight. Harrison. Harrison is 34, sharply dressed, works in corporate finance, and until yesterday, he was my fiancé. We met 3 years ago during the darkest period of my life. The world was practically shut down, the global supply chains were a disaster, and our family business was teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy. Bradley was panicking, ready to declare defeat, but I refused to let the company die. I worked 20-hour days. I renegotiated with our overseas manufacturers, I begged our national distributors for grace periods, and I personally rebuilt our operational infrastructure from the ground up. During those grueling months, Harrison was there. He would bring me black coffee at 2 in the morning. He would rub my shoulders while I stared blankly at spreadsheets. He told me I was brilliant. He told me I was strong. He made me feel seen, not just as the family workhorse, but as a woman. I fell entirely, stupidly in love with him. He became my safe harbor. So, when he came to me 2 months ago over a quiet dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, sliding a thick folder of documents across the table, my guard was completely down. He poured me a glass of expensive red wine, smiled that reassuring, handsome smile, and started talking in soothing financial jargon. He explained it was a temporary restructuring strategy. A way to optimize our tax liabilities before the end of the fiscal year, considering the massive revenue increase I had generated. He said it was just standard corporate housekeeping to protect our assets as we moved into marriage. I was so burnt out from running the day-to-day operations, so depleted from managing Clara's wedding vendor meltdowns, that I didn't even put on my reading glasses. I just skimmed the cover page. I saw the words temporary and tax optimization. I looked at the man who held my hand when I cried from exhaustion, the man I was going to marry, and I picked up my pen. I signed every single dotted line he pointed to. I trusted him. You don't look for a knife in the hands of the person patching your wounds. That was my fatal mistake. I assumed love meant loyalty. In business, and apparently in my family, love is just a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Friday morning, the day before the wedding. My alarm went off at 5 in the morning, and my body ached like I had been hit by a truck. I had one last run to make to the venue to drop off some fragile table centerpieces. I dragged myself out to the driveway where Samuel was waiting. Samuel is 55 years old, our family driver for 11 years. He drove me to my college graduation. He picked me up the night I got my heart broken in my early 20s. He is a quiet, stoic man, but he observes everything. He knows this family's secrets better than we do. I climbed into the back seat of the heavy black SUV and let my head fall against the cool leather window. I just needed 30 minutes of peace. We drove back toward the massive family estate. The main house has an expansive underground garage, a cavernous concrete space where Bradley keeps his collection of vintage cars and where all the wedding supplies were currently being stored. As Samuel steered the heavy vehicle down the ramp into the dim, cool air of the garage, he suddenly hit the brakes. He didn't pull into our designated spot. Instead, he smoothly reversed the SUV into a dark, blind corner behind a concrete pillar, far away from the overhead lights. Before I could even ask what he was doing, he cut the engine. He turned off the headlights. He turned off the interior cabin lights. The garage fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Samuel turned around in his seat. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He looked at me with an urgency I had never seen in his eyes before. "Morgan," he whispered, his voice barely making a sound. "Drop down to the floorboards right now." I blinked, completely disoriented, the lack of sleep making me slow. "What?" "Samuel, what are you talking about?" "I have a million things to do." I reached for the door handle. He reached back and grabbed my wrist. Hard. "Hide deep in the shadows and wait," he urged, his voice trembling slightly. "You must hear this. Please, just trust me." The pure desperation in his eyes chilled me. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a drill. My instincts, honed from years of corporate warfare, screamed at me to listen. I unbuckled my seatbelt. I slid off the comfortable leather seat and pressed my body flat against the carpeted floorboards behind the driver's seat. The smell of old dust, shoe polish, and faint engine oil filled my nose. I lay there in complete darkness, my heart starting to thud heavily against my ribs. 30 seconds passed. Then, I heard the heavy metal door from the main house creak open. Footsteps echoed on the concrete. Familiar footsteps. 3 people. And they were walking straight toward where our car was hidden in the dark. The physical sensation of hiding is something you never really forget. The floorboards were cold, seeping through the fabric of my slacks. I held my breath, terrified that the sound of my own lungs expanding would give me away. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the low hum of casual conversation. They stopped maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the front bumper of the SUV. I recognized the expensive click of my father's leather loafers. I heard the light, rhythmic tap of Clara's designer heels. And then, the steady, confident stride of Harrison. They were standing near the staging area where the caterers had left the overflow alcohol. "Are the vintage champagnes loaded for the rehearsal dinner?" Bradley's voice boomed slightly in the echoey space. It was his usual tone, demanding, concerned only with the aesthetics of the event. "Yes, Bradley, everything is handled," Harrison replied smoothly. Hearing Harrison's voice so close, yet so completely unaware of my presence, made my stomach do a strange flip. It was like watching a play from behind the curtain. "Good," Bradley said, sighing heavily. "Because frankly, I am exhausted from walking on eggshells around Morgan." "Did she transfer the final payment for the florist?" I pressed my hand over my mouth in the dark. Walking on eggshells? I had practically bought the farm so they could have fresh eggs. Clara let out a soft, melodic laugh. It was the laugh she used when she was being charmingly cruel. "Of course she did, Daddy. She wired the remaining $12,000 last night. I told you she would." Morgan has a massive hero complex. If she isn't swooping in to save the day and pay the bills, she doesn't know who she is. I closed my eyes tightly in the dark. Hero complex. That is what they called my sacrifice. That is what they called the nights I couldn't sleep because I was worried about keeping a roof over our heads. A hero complex. But the knife was only just starting to go in. What came next wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. Well, let her feel like the hero for one more day, Bradley said, his voice dropping into that serious, boardroom cadence he used when discussing company assets. Harrison, are the final transfers ready for Monday morning? The ink is dry? I frowned in the darkness. What transfers? Everything is locked in, Harrison said. His tone was brisk, professional, entirely devoid of the warmth he showed me when we were alone. The tax documents she signed 2 months ago were fully processed and quietly filed. As of Monday at 9 in the morning, her controlling operational shares will be legally transferred to Dylan's name as Clara's husband and consolidated under my management portfolio. The air left my lungs in one violent rush. My vision swam with black spots, even in the darkness. The tax documents. The ones I signed because I trusted him. They weren't temporary. They weren't for tax optimization. They were a deed of surrender. They had forged me into their own exit strategy. Good, Bradley muttered. Morgan did a fine job rebuilding the supply chains, I'll give her that. But she is too rigid. Too controlling. We need a more flexible management structure moving forward. Dylan will do whatever Harrison tells him to do, and we can finally pull some decent equity out of this company without Morgan scrutinizing every single expense. Exactly, Harrison agreed. She's exhausting, honestly. Everything is a crisis. Everything is a battle with her. Once the wedding is over and the transfer is public, the corporate structure will be much cleaner. No more drama. I can finally run the acquisitions without her blocking my votes. Cleaner, Clara chimed in, sounding completely unbothered by the fact that they were stealing my life's work. Just please, guys, no drama before my vows. Let her play maid of honor, let her smile for the cameras. After tomorrow, you can lock her out of the banking portals, and she can go have her little meltdown privately. Don't worry, Harrison said, and I could practically hear his arrogant smile. By the time she realizes she's been locked out, the board will have already ratified the new leadership. It will be too late for her to do anything but pack her desk. They lingered for another minute, discussing the weather forecast for Saturday, as if they hadn't just casually discussed assassinating my entire future. Then, their footsteps retreated. The heavy metal door slammed shut, echoing through the garage, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. I didn't move. For a long time, I just lay there on the floorboards, staring into the black fabric of the seat above me. I expected to cry. I expected the familiar sting of tears, the suffocating weight of a panic attack. I had given them my youth. I had paid their debts. I had loved Harrison with a fierce, protective loyalty. And they had sat in a room, looked at my devotion, and figured out how to monetize it. But the tears never came. Instead, something deep inside my chest, the soft, forgiving part of me that always made excuses for my father, the part that always protected my sister, the part that loved a man who didn't exist, just snapped. It didn't break loudly. It just died quietly, like a candle being snuffed out in a vacuum. The shock evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity that was sharper than anything I had ever felt in my life. I slowly pulled myself up from the floorboards and sat back on the leather seat. I smoothed down my wrinkled slacks. I reached up and adjusted my hair in the rearview mirror. Samuel was staring at me through the mirror, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. His eyes were full of deep, sorrowful pity. He expected me to break down. "Miss Morgan," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "Start the car, Samuel," I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't waver. It sounded like it belonged to a stranger. It sounded like a CEO. "Where to, miss?" he asked quietly, starting the engine. "Take me to the office," I replied, staring straight ahead at the concrete wall. "I have a wedding to attend tomorrow. But today, I have some paperwork to review." The good sister who funded the parties and fixed the mistakes was dead. Now, they were going to have to deal with the architect who built the building they were trying to steal. Please hit the like button on this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below telling us which city you are watching from. Every comment helps this video reach a wider audience. Thank you so much for your support. Friday evening. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private, exclusive country club overlooking a pristine golf course. The air smelled of expensive roasted garlic, rich red wine, and the heavy perfume of 50 wealthy guests. I stood near the entrance, wearing a dark blue silk dress that cost more than my first car, playing my role perfectly. I smiled. I greeted the extended family members. I made small talk with the groomsmen about the weather and the stock market. Nobody looking at me could have possibly guessed that just 12 hours prior, I had been lying on the dirty floorboards of an SUV, listening to my family plan my execution. Then, Harrison arrived. He walked into the dining room looking like he owned the world, dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly swept back. He spotted me, smiled his signature $1,000,000 smile, and walked straight over. He wrapped his arms around me and kissed my cheek. He smelled like bergamot and expensive gin. "You look absolutely stunning tonight, Morgan," he whispered, his hand resting comfortably on my lower back. I forced my facial muscles not to flinch. I forced my heart rate to remain steady. "Thank you," I replied smoothly. "You look very handsome yourself." We sat together at the head table. For 2 hours, I endured the absolute torture of his affection. He held my hand under the table. He poured my water. He laughed at my jokes. Every single gesture, every loving glance, was a calculated transaction. I sat there, chewing on an $80 piece of filet mignon that tasted like ash in my mouth, analyzing his micro-expressions. I realized then that his affection was never real. He was a man who saw relationships as equity. He saw my business acumen as an asset to be acquired, and once he had the signature he needed, my usefulness was over. Halfway through the dinner, Bradley stood up and tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The room fell silent. My father raised his glass, looking down the table at Clara and Dylan, and then, slowly, his eyes shifted to me. "To family," Bradley announced, his voice booming with artificial warmth. "In a world full of unpredictable variables, family is the one constant. Family is about trust. It is about building a foundation that lasts for generations. To trust, and to the future." The guests clapped politely and echoed the toast. Harrison squeezed my hand and smiled at me. I raised my glass, meeting my father's eyes directly. "To trust," I repeated quietly, taking a slow sip. Inside my mind, I wasn't drinking to their future. I was running complex mental math. I was calculating the exact net worth of our family company, currently valued at roughly $42 million. I was mapping out the logistical supply routes, the offshore accounts, and the specific vendor credit lines that kept that $42 million valuation afloat. They thought they had outsmarted the workhorse. They didn't realize they had just challenged the architect. Saturday morning arrived with bright, mocking sunshine. The wedding day. If the rehearsal dinner was a luxury, the wedding was a masterpiece of financial excess. The venue was a historic grand ballroom in the city center. When I walked in that morning to supervise the setup, the sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from crystal chandeliers. A 12-piece string quartet was already tuning their instruments on a velvet-draped stage. Tables were covered in gold-embroidered linens. Every single detail screamed old money and untouchable status. And I had paid for almost all of it. The $75,000 venue deposit. The $20,000 floral arrangements. The customized 5-course menu. I spent the morning running around with a clipboard, handling the catering delays and making sure the lighting technicians got the amber glow exactly right, just the way Clara wanted. Around noon, I went up to the bridal suite. Clara was sitting in front of a massive vanity mirror, wearing her custom designer gown, while a team of 3 makeup artists hovered around her. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale. When the stylist stepped back, Clara looked at me in the mirror. I walked over, my hands perfectly steady, and gently adjusted the delicate lace veil over her shoulders. I smoothed out the train of her dress. Clara reached up and placed her hand over mine. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with what looked like genuine emotion. "Oh, Morgan," she whispered softly. "Look at this place. Look at everything. None of this would have happened without you. You made this perfect." I looked down at my little sister. I thought about the conversation in the garage. I thought about her calling me exhausting and laughing at my hero complex. I kept my face entirely neutral. I offered a soft, sisterly smile. "I know, Clara," I said softly. "I know exactly what I did." She beamed, entirely missing the double meaning. She thought I was accepting her gratitude. I was actually acknowledging my own leverage. The ceremony was flawless. Dylan cried. Clara looked angelic. Harrison stood in the front row, looking proud and distinguished. I stood right behind Clara, holding her bouquet, playing the perfect maid of honor. But my mind wasn't in the church. My mind was already fast-forwarding to Monday morning. The real humiliation didn't happen privately. It didn't happen in an office or through an email. It happened on stage, under the bright lights, in front of 400 of the wealthiest and most influential people in our city. It was 10 o'clock at night. Dinner had been served, the cake had been cut, and the champagne was flowing freely. Bradley walked up to the main stage and took the microphone from the bandleader. The room quieted down. Bradley cleared his throat and gave a long, emotional speech about watching his daughters grow up. Then he turned toward my table. "Morgan, come up here, sweetheart," he called out warmly. I stood up, smoothing my dress, and walked up the steps to the stage. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Bradley put a heavy arm around my shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen, the backbone of this family," he announced. The crowd cheered louder. I smiled out at the sea of faces. But then, the tone of his voice shifted to his formal business cadence. "As many of you know, our family business has seen unprecedented growth over the last 3 years. But to continue growing, we must evolve. Tonight, as we celebrate a new marriage, we are also proud to announce that our company is officially transitioning its leadership to the next generation." A massive digital screen behind us suddenly lit up. The crowd gasped softly. It was a slideshow, but not of childhood photos. It was a picture of Harrison and Dylan, sitting in a boardroom, signing official corporate documents. Effective immediately, Bradley declared into the microphone, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom. "Ownership and operational control have been restructured." I hadn't been told. I hadn't been consulted. They were doing this here, in public, so I would be trapped by social convention. Suddenly, Harrison stepped up onto the stage beside me. He smiled at the audience, then slid his arm around my waist. His fingers dug sharply into my side, a silent warning. He leaned his mouth close to my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "Don't make a scene," he whispered, his voice dark and commanding. "It is just strategic. We will talk later. Smile." The crowd erupted into a standing ovation. They thought this was a beautiful passing of the torch. They didn't see the contract timestamps backdated to my digital signature. They didn't know they were clapping for a corporate hijacking. I looked at Harrison. I looked at Bradley. I looked out at Clara, who was clapping and cheering from the front table. They expected me to cry. They expected me to break down or scream or run out of the room in humiliation. But I didn't. I stood perfectly still, looking out at the flashing cameras. And I smiled. It wasn't a forced smile. It was a cold, terrifyingly calm smile. Because standing there, feeling Harrison's fingers digging into my ribs, I realized they had made their final, fatal mistake. They thought I was a victim. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their entire kingdom to the ground. I stayed for another hour. I toasted the bride. I danced one slow dance with Harrison, letting him whisper damage control and corporate buzzwords into my ear. "You're overreacting," he told me softly as we swayed to the music. "You still have a job. You just do not have the voting shares anymore. It is better for us this way." I nodded like a naive woman who believed him. Then I told him I had a headache. I got my coat, tipped the valet $100, and drove home alone. Pain does not always explode. Sometimes it organizes. I unlocked the door to my apartment at 2:14 in the morning. The city outside was quiet, just the distant hum of traffic. I didn't turn on the main lights. I didn't take off my makeup. I kicked off my painful high heels, walked straight into my home office, and sat down at my desk. The glowing light of the computer monitor illuminated the dark room. I logged into the company's secure server. Now, here's the thing about Bradley and Harrison. They are big-picture men. They like talking about valuations, acquisitions, and golf course handshakes. They despise the actual mechanics of running a logistics empire. 3 years ago, when I was rebuilding the company from near bankruptcy, I instituted a dual authentication security protocol for all operational accounts to prevent the very fraud they just committed. They thought I had skimmed the tax documents they gave me 2 months ago. They forgot that I never skim anything. By 3 o'clock in the morning, I wasn't crying. I was mapping the battlefield. I pulled up the master vendor contracts, the supply chain agreements, and the bank liquidity covenants. Yes, the restructuring documents I signed gave Harrison and Dylan the controlling voting shares. On paper, they owned the company. But operational liquidity, overseas vendor trust, and deferred tax liabilities, those were tied directly to a series of transitional clauses. Specifically, Clause 7b. I wrote Clause 7b myself 3 years ago. It stated, in extremely dense legal language, that any transfer of executive authority or change in primary signatories required my explicit, real-time digital authorization to the vendor network. If leadership changed without my direct, written confirmation to our partners, all active vendor relationships, credit lines, and deferred payment schedules were immediately nullified. Without those credit lines, the company had to pay for international shipping up front in cash. Cash they did not have, because they spent it on a wedding. No vendors meant no supply chain. No supply chain meant no product launch next quarter. No product launch meant their $42 million valuation was completely fictional. They didn't steal a functioning crown. They stole a hollow shell. And I was the only one holding the engine. The silence of my apartment was absolute, broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. It was 4 in the morning. I opened my secure corporate email client. I was not going to hire a lawyer to scream at them. I was going to let the architecture of the business collapse on its own weight. I drafted 3 very specific, very lethal emails. Email 1 was addressed to our top manufacturing supplier in Taiwan. Subject line: urgent notification regarding structural clarifications and operational holds. The body of the email was strictly professional. I informed them that as of Saturday night, I was no longer the controlling authority of the company, and therefore, I could not legally authorize the rolling credit line for the incoming shipment of raw materials. I advised them to pause all cargo loading until the new leadership, Harrison and Dylan, could provide upfront cash guarantees. Email 2 went to our regional logistics distributor in Chicago. Subject line: immediate suspension of net 90 payment terms. I cited Clause 7b, explaining that due to unauthorized signatory transfers, the corporate guarantee on our freight accounts was temporarily invalid. I told them to hold all warehouse releases. Email 3 was the kill shot. It went to the senior partners at Apex Capital, the private equity firm that Harrison had been secretly courting for a $10 million cash injection. Subject line: notice of undisclosed governance, restructuring, and liquidity risk. I kept it brief. I informed the investors that a major transfer of equity had occurred without a formal internal audit, and as the former chief operating officer, I was officially stepping back from all fiduciary responsibilities. In the finance world, those words are the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater. I reviewed the drafts. There was no emotion in them. No anger, no bitterness. Just cold, hard corporate compliance. I set the automated timer on my outbox. I scheduled all 3 emails to send exactly at 8:45 on Monday morning. Then, I closed my laptop, walked into my bedroom, and finally took off my bridesmaid dress. I slept for the first time in months with a perfectly clear conscience. Monday morning arrived. The air in my apartment was still and quiet. I woke up at 8 o'clock, took a long, hot shower, and put on comfortable sweatpants. I walked into the kitchen, ground some fresh coffee beans, and started the French press. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping my coffee, watching the digital clock on my microwave. This was the exact time Bradley, Harrison, and the new puppet Dylan were sitting down for their first official board meeting under their new leadership. I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. The digital clock turned to 8:45. Somewhere in the cloud, my 3 emails left the server. At 8:52, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was an automated alert. The supplier in Taiwan had replied directly to the general board inbox, which I still had copied to my phone. We were entirely unaware of ownership transition, the email read. As per Clause 7b, we require immediate wire transfer confirmation of $2.5 million before continuing shipment. All cargo is currently frozen. I took another sip of my coffee. It tasted excellent. At 9:04, the first text message came in from Harrison. It just said, "Morgan, what the hell did you send them?" I did not reply. I watched the typing bubble appear, disappear, and appear again. At 9:11, my phone started ringing. It was Bradley. The caller ID flashed his smiling face, a picture taken at a golf tournament last year. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. At 9:15, the earthquake hit. My email chimed with a forwarded message from Apex Capital addressed to Harrison. The investor was pulling out. Please note that due to sudden structural irregularities and unverified leadership transitions, Apex Capital is officially withdrawing our letter of intent for the $10 million funding round pending a full external audit. At 9:27, the logistics distributor in Chicago locked our warehouse accounts. The delivery trucks were grounded. Within 42 minutes of my emails going out, the company's valuation dropped before it even had a chance to stabilize under their new regime. The supply chain was paralyzed. The investors were gone. The cash flow was dead. They had wanted a clean exit. I gave them a catastrophic system failure. At exactly 9:31 in the morning, the heavy doorbell of my apartment rang. It didn't just ring. It buzzed aggressively, repeatedly, like someone was leaning their entire body weight against it. I set my coffee mug down, walked slowly to the front door, and unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the door open. Harrison stood in the hallway. He looked completely different without a microphone and an audience applauding him. His tie was loosened, his hair was a mess, and his face was drained of all color. He was breathing heavily, clutching his phone in his hand like a weapon. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and absolute panic. He tried to step into my apartment, but I firmly held the door frame, blocking his path. I leaned casually against the wood, crossing my arms. "Good morning, Harrison. I am just drinking my coffee. What can I do for the new executive management?" "Do not play games with me, Morgan," he snapped, his eyes wild. "You're sabotaging us. The Taiwanese supplier just grounded 3 shipping containers. Apex Capital just pulled out of the term sheet. You are intentionally destroying the company." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No heartbreak, no longing. Just a clinical observation of a man realizing he was drowning. "No, I am not sabotaging anything," I said calmly. "I am simply exercising the compliance rights you forgot I still hold. You wanted my authority gone. I removed it. This is what the company looks like without me running it." His jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth would crack. "You are going to ruin the family. Bradley is having a panic attack in his office right now. You are doing this out of spite because of a simple business decision." I smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. "You tried to erase me, Harrison. You used my love for you as a blindfold so you could steal my life's work and hand it to my sister's idiot husband." Silence stretched between us in the hallway. He opened his mouth to argue, to deploy some corporate defense, but he had nothing. Then I said the one thing he was not prepared for. "You think this is me ruining you?" I whispered, leaning slightly closer so he could hear the absolute certainty in my voice. "Harrison, I haven't even started yet." He stared at me, his eyes wide, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. He slowly backed away from the door. This time, He believed me. I closed the door quietly in his face and locked the deadbolt. They did not collapse instantly. An instant collapse would have been merciful. Instead, they unraveled agonizingly over the next few days. By Wednesday morning, 3 more major vendors had requested formal legal clarification regarding the governance restructuring. By Thursday afternoon, the primary corporate bank flagged the restructuring documents for inconsistencies, freezing the main operating accounts. Translation: zero liquidity. Nobody was getting paid. The panic seeped out of the boardroom and into the family. Clara texted me on Thursday evening from her honeymoon resort in the Maldives. Her message was frantic. My credit card just declined at the spa. Dylan says the company accounts are frozen. Morgan, what did you do? Stop throwing a tantrum and fix this. You are ruining my honeymoon. That message almost made me laugh out loud. I deleted it without replying. On Friday night, Bradley showed up at my apartment. He didn't bang on the door like Harrison. He knocked softly. When I let him in, he looked 10 years older. He stood in my living room, shifting his weight awkwardly, looking around like a guest who didn't recognize the house anymore. Morgan, please, he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. The bank is threatening to call in our primary loans. We are bleeding cash. We can fix this privately. Just sign the vendor release forms. Fix it privately? I asked, walking over to pour myself a glass of water. Like you fixed my removal publicly on a stage in front of 400 people? He flinched, looking down at his shoes. It was just business, honey. Harrison convinced me it was the best path forward for tax purposes. We didn't want to hurt you. I set the glass down. No, Dad. You didn't care if it hurt me, as long as it didn't inconvenience you. You assumed I would just take the hit and keep working out of loyalty. But my loyalty is gone. I am not signing the releases. Let the company sink. He left looking completely defeated. I knew what was coming next. The legal threats. But I had already outmaneuvered them there too. Earlier that week, I had quietly filed a formal request for a compliance audit with the federal regulatory authorities regarding the backdated digital signatures on my tax documents. Audits do not scream. They dissect. And when the regulatory board dissects a forged document, somebody goes to federal prison. By Sunday, Bradley's high-priced corporate lawyer reached out to my personal attorney. They wanted to discuss a settlement. Settlement. That is an interesting word. You only ask for a settlement when you realize you have lost the war. And, because I was no longer negotiating out of emotion, I was negotiating from absolute leverage. The settlement meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at noon. It took place in a neutral location, a high-rise corporate law office downtown. The room had glass walls, a long mahogany table, and the suffocating air of forced corporate politeness. I walked in wearing a sharp black suit. My lawyer sat beside me. Across the table sat Bradley, looking pale, his lawyer, looking nervous, and Harrison, who refused to make eye contact with me. They expected a bitter fight. They expected me to demand my operational control back, to yell at Harrison, to demand apologies, and then quietly return to the corner they had assigned me to fix their mess. Bradley's lawyer cleared his throat and slid a document across the table. Morgan, we are prepared to offer you a 30% reinstatement of your voting shares, a slight bump in salary, and full restoration of your vendor authority. We just need you to sign off on the audit cancellation today. I didn't even look at the paper. I slid it back across the table. Then I opened my briefcase, pulled out a single, thick manila folder, and placed it right in the center of the mahogany wood. I am not here to reclaim control, I said calmly, my voice steady and cold. I am not here to save your supply chain. I am here to exit. Confusion flickered across Bradley's face. Harrison finally looked up, frowning deeply. Inside that folder, I continued, is a buyout proposal. I want a fair market valuation of my original shares based on last month's numbers, before you tanked the company. I want a clean transfer. And I want the entire amount, $8.5 million, transferred into my personal accounts in liquid cash by this Friday at 5 in the evening. Bradley's lawyer scoffed, leaning back in his chair. That is absurd. The company doesn't have $8 million in liquid cash right now. We cannot authorize that kind of buyout. I smiled thinly and tapped the folder. Attached to that buyout proposal is a copy of the compliance report I filed last week with the regulatory authorities. It details the precise structural irregularities and the fraudulent backdating of my digital signature on the tax documents Harrison prepared. I haven't accused anyone of a crime yet. I simply requested a formal review of the transition. The color completely drained from Harrison's face. He knew exactly what that meant. Corporate fraud. Forgery. It meant his career in finance was permanently over, and he was looking at prison time. If I am officially erased from ownership, I explained softly, locking eyes with Harrison, then my signature cannot legally appear on any transitional authority documents. If it does, and the authorities review it, it becomes a criminal inquiry. Buy me out by Friday, and I withdraw the request due to an amicable separation. Fail to wire the funds, and the audit proceeds next Monday. Bradley's hand trembled slightly as he reached out and touched the folder. Morgan, he whispered, his voice cracking. To pull that much cash out right now, we will have to liquidate the warehouses. We will have to leverage the family estate. You would destroy us. I met my father's eyes, feeling the last lingering thread of my childhood attachment snap. No, Dad, I replied softly. You destroyed yourselves. I am just choosing not to save you. The room fell into a dead, heavy silence. The checkmate was absolute. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the glass room, leaving them trapped in the cage they had built for me. By Thursday evening, a day early, my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. $8.5 million had been successfully wired into my accounts. They had to take out a predatory emergency loan and sell off 30% of their shipping fleet to do it, effectively crippling their own operational capacity for the next decade. I publicly resigned on Friday morning. The remaining investors reframed the narrative to save face. Founder exits amid governance restructuring, the financial blogs read. It sounded graceful, clean, and controlled. But behind closed doors, Harrison lost his executive position, Dylan was overwhelmed and incompetent, and Bradley was left captaining a sinking ship. Clara texted me one last time a month later. Was the money worth destroying your own family? She asked. I didn't reply, because this was never about revenge, and it was never just about the money. It was about correction. They built their future assuming I would always stay small, quietly bearing the weight while they stole the crown. Instead, I left with my capital, my reputation completely intact, and something far more valuable, clarity. The morning before her wedding, they thought I was hiding in the dark. They never realized I was just waiting for the lights to come on. And now, I do not fund weddings or save failing companies. I build empires alone. They built their future assuming I would always stay small and quietly bear the weight. I walked away with my reputation, my capital, and my peace, leaving them in the ruins of their own greed. So, tell me, am I the asshole for letting their empire burn? Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? See you in the next one.